You helped devise the U.S. government strategy for the war on terrorism and contributed to policymaking for Afghanistan and Iraq. I just wanted to first ask, how and why did you decide to come to Duke? It's a pleasure to have you.
No, thank you. I was invited by the Duke Federalist Society and the American Constitutional Society?
American Grand Strategy program and the American Constitution Society.
Right.
Okay.
And so I'm going to be giving a talk later this afternoon.
Okay, and the remarks are titled, Setting the Record Straight, Legal and Strategic Thoughts on the War on Terrorism. Just in general, what do you plan to speak about?
I plan to talk about some of the considerations, especially right after 9/11, that dealt with the trade-offs between public safety and civil liberties, and the tensions that existed after 9/11 about the concerns about preserving our constitutional system. Mm-hmm. First of all, preserving it from the damage that could be done by terrorist attacks,
right.
And then also preserving it from the damage that could be done by certain types of reactions to the terrorist attacks. And I mean, these were really important, weighty, difficult things for people in the government to work through. And there's a kind of cartoonish image that some people have that people in the Bush administration were either unconcerned about or even unsympathetic to civil liberties, and were rubbing their hands eagerly saying, oh wow, we've been hit by terrorists, now it gives us an opportunity to destroy some civil liberties.
Right.
It wasn't like that.
Mm-hmm.
On the contrary, there were people who were actually deeply concerned about civil liberties and decided that strong action to protect the country from follow-on attacks was actually crucial to the preservation of our constitutional system and our civil liberties.
Okay, well that segues well into Iraq, which I know you advised Bush and Rumsfeld on issues from North Korea to Israel-Palestine, but since we have limited time, I'd like to focus on the most controversial issue. So just starting off, why in your mind did the United States invade Iraq?
Well, first of all, I wrote a book called War and Decision, which is largely devoted to answering that question, and it's a lengthy book, so I can't do justice to mm-hmm. that important question in just a minute or two. But in summary, what I would say is Iraq was a serious national security problem for a dozen years before we invaded in 2003. From the time that Saddam took over Kuwait, Iraq was very high up on the U.S. Agenda of international security problems. And when 9/11 occurred, the United States re-examined all of its major national security issues, including, of course, Iraq. I mean, we looked at terrorism differently in light of 9/11. We looked at proliferation dangers differently. We looked at North Korea differently. We looked at Latin America differently. We looked at everything
right. In
light of the 9/11 attack. We understood in a way that we hadn't before that America has major vulnerabilities. We understood the danger of the Islamist extremist network mm-hmm. that considered itself at war with us. And we looked at the question of how do we deal with the network of terrorist groups and their state supporters. Mm-hmm. And we had to come up with strategies to deal with all the major terrorist groups and all of the major state supporters. And in the case of Iraq, the president came to the conclusion that the danger of leaving Saddam Hussein in power exceeded the very substantial dangers of removing him by force.
Right. Well, besides the two justifications of WMDs and the connection between Saddam and Al-Qaeda you talk about this idea of anticipatory self-defense. And so disregarding the other two, which I guess have been disproven. Putting that aside, just based on purely anticipatory self-defense as a justification, why Iraq over North Korea or Iran or Syria?
The dangers from Iraq that the president weighed, as I understand his decision, the dangers were that we were going to wind up in a major conflict with Iraq inevitably down the road. Iraq was very hostile. Saddam was a recidivist aggressor. Iraq was the only country in the world that was shooting at American forces every day, and they were firing at the American and British pilots who were patrolling the no-fly zones. And Saddam was systematically dismantling the containment measures that the UN Security Council had put in place throughout the 90s.
Right.
And so the president's fear was that we were inevitably going to be confronting Saddam down the road, and we didn't want to let Saddam pick the time and place for that confrontation, especially because if we waited, there was the danger that he would have developed his WMD capabilities. We knew that he didn't have nuclear weapons, but we were fearful that he would get nuclear weapons. What the intelligence community told us is that if he could obtain fissile material, he could have nuclear weapons within a year.
Okay.
In other words, he had the engineering, he had the plans, he had other materiel, he had the facilities. He basically needed the fissile material. And we knew that, for example, North Korea was a country that had fissile material and did not have any money.
Right.
Whereas Iraq had substantial money because it had corrupted the oil for food program and obtained large financial reserves. It had substantial money, and it just needed fissile material to complete its nuclear weapon. Anyway, so those were the kinds of concerns that weighed on the president. Now, you said, why Iraq rather than other countries? I think the answer is that with regard to Iraq, you had a problem of large magnitude and considerable urgency, where the president came to the conclusion that all reasonable means short of war had already been tried. We had exhausted other avenues. As you know, there were 16 Security Council resolutions against Iraq trying means short of war to deal with the threat. That was not true with North Korea, with Iran, with these other countries. With those other countries, before you could even responsibly consider military action, a lot more diplomacy would have to be done.
Right.
So I think that was what made, I mean, the fact that there had been a dozen years of efforts to contain Iraq with economic sanctions and weapons inspections and no-fly zones and no-drive zones and limited military strikes, he really had exhausted all the other means short of war to deal with the problem.